Have you ever stood before a secret so old, its ink had turned to air? Tonight's tale isn't just about a death, it's about the murder of truth. A book written in blood, a cipher carved in silence, and a truth so dangerous, history itself would burn to keep it buried. The question is, should the truth be found or forgotten forever? The moon rode low over the Carpathians, casting a ghostly sheen upon the polished brass of the Lorient du Minuet as it sliced through the velvet night like a whisper of fate, its dining car aglow with soft candlelight, crystal glasses chiming beneath swaying chandeliers, and hushed conversations fluttering through the velvet-draped corridors like forgotten prayers. Hercule Poirot, ever meticulous, sat perfectly composed beside a window, his dinner untouched as he studied a curious leather-bound journal that had appeared beside his dessert plate, unclaimed, unnoticed, unremembered by any passenger or staff. Its spine was cracked, its pages yellowed, and upon the worn cover rested a sigil long believed buried in the past, a belladonna flower wrapped in an Ouroboros. As Poirot's fingers brushed the relic, a voice broke through the delicate din, soft, English, and hauntingly familiar. "You may not remember me," said the woman cloaked in navy velvet, her gloved hand resting lightly atop a silver-handled cane, "but I remember everything." She smelled of crushed violets and vanished before dawn, leaving no trace of her name on the manifest, no memory in the minds of fellow travelers, and no physical evidence beyond the journal itself, now stained faintly with what might have been ink or blood. Within its brittle pages, Poirot found scattered thoughts, alchemical formulas, cryptic riddles, and verses pointing toward a legendary volume long believed to have been lost to war and madness, the Belladonna manuscript. "If I vanish, red one in confession, tell Poirot. The truth sleeps beneath the belladonna." It was not long before Poirot's scrutiny fell upon Count Miklos Vassihilii, an austere Hungarian nobleman traveling with a mute valet and a violin case he guarded obsessively. Despite bearing none of the marks of a musician, his words were laced with fatalism and philosophical melancholy. "It is a strange burden to be the last custodian of a dangerous truth," he had murmured, his eyes unblinking, his presence weighted with something unspoken. Poirot noticed signs others missed, notes slipped into napkins, riddles folded into roses in the lounge, even puzzles tucked beneath his cabin door. Each clue written in violet black ink scented faintly of dried nightshade, always pointing to a betrayal long buried, and a sisterhood once devoted to guarding ink and flame. At the next stop in Belgrade, a new passenger joined them, Eleonora Vass, a quiet librarian whose fear of the word belladonna was visceral, her teacup rattling, her voice barely a whisper as she said, "My grandmother died for it, and now it wants me too." She would speak no further, but her silence told Poirot enough. Then, at 12:01 a.m., the train was swallowed by darkness. In the heart of that silence, a scream rang out, sharp, abrupt, final. When the power returned, Count Miklos was dead, alone in his locked cabin, his mouth stuffed with a single pressed belladonna flower. No sign of violence, no forced entry, only a cryptic note clutched in his palm. "Let the poisoner dance. She never forgets." Poirot pieced together the fragments with chilling clarity. The velvet woman, the ink, the order, the fragmented manuscript hidden in code, verse, and blood. The belladonna manuscript, long thought destroyed, had been divided and protected by a secret order of philosopher scribes, women who gave their sanity and lives to ensure its knowledge never again endangered the world. One fragment remained, and someone aboard this train would kill to possess it. In the final confrontation within the rearmost carriage, Poirot revealed the truth. It was not Vance, nor the silent velvet spectre, but Eleonora Vass herself. Her family had guarded the manuscript for generations. The ink was theirs, and the burden too. She had only sought to protect a legacy, but when the Count threatened to burn the journal, she had acted in fear. The poison, she wept, was never meant for him. It was meant for the fire. Poirot, torn between reason and mercy, stared at the scarlet-bound codex one final time, then threw it into the hearth. The flames consumed it without a sound. In Istanbul, no charges were filed. The Count was buried in silence, and Poirot, alone in his suite that evening, placed a fresh orchid in a vase, and stared at his own reflection. "The little gray cells," he murmured to no one, "ache not from the mystery, but from the weight of memory." And from his pocket, he drew the last remnant, a single dried petal of belladonna, brittle and unburned, a reminder that some truths, no matter how deeply buried, still bloom in the shadows. It began with the faint scent of magnolia and a woman dressed entirely in ivory, her shawl trailing like mist as she moved soundlessly through the grand dining salon of the Stella Maris, bound for Constantinople. Beneath her veiled hat, her presence was ghost-like, evocative, unsettling, and Hercule Poirot, ever observant, felt the stirrings of a memory buried deep beneath a crypt in Venice. Moments later, a pale steward stumbled in, whispering of something left in the lounge. There, atop the grand piano under flickering light, lay a bundle of scorched silk tied in a faded red ribbon, concealing a half-burnt diary etched with Latin invocations and a single line, "Tell him the truth sleeps under the white magnolia." No one had seen the woman enter or leave, and yet her presence clung like shadow. Poirot summoned the captain, for something had begun that no one aboard yet understood. The passengers were varied and strange: a voiceless opera singer, a Belgian diplomat steeped in Templar rumor, an English reverend drawn to mysticism, and Lady Astrid Hawthorne, widow and collector of poisons. And though none admitted to having seen the ivory woman, unease threaded every conversation. Poirot's investigation deepened when a second package, left at his door, revealed a map of a ruined monastery and a magnolia petal pinned with a needle carved of bone. Memory, not madness, whispered through these signs, and its voice was ancient. Miss Aloan Bright, a young archivist traveling under a false name, confessed to stealing a page from the forbidden ledger of Santa Lucia del Fiore, one that named victims erased from history after a fire that consumed the scriptorium. She claimed one name on the page was Poirot's own, yet he remained unmoved. That night, Lady Astrid was found unconscious, a dew-laden magnolia left on her pillow, though all doors and windows had been sealed. In her hand, a rosary made of bone. When she awoke, her voice was foreign, trembling, muttering Latin. Custos sanguinis tacet, the blood guardian is silent. The trail led to a manuscript, Illinois Labyrinto dei Petali, written in secret by cloistered women who documented the sins of untouchable men. The magnolia, symbol of silence, was their warning and their shield. Captain Moreau then revealed a painting mysteriously added to the ship's gallery, depicting a woman in ivory walking barefoot through a labyrinth of petals, her hands cupped around a flickering flame, her eyes void. In the frame's corner, the Ouroboros wrapped in magnolia. Poirot knew then they were not seeking a killer, but navigating a memory preserved in fire and sealed in silence. The next morning, Aloan vanished. Her mirror bore a single phrase painted in ash: Fiam reis catacuit. Let him be guilty who was silent. That night, Poirot gathered the passengers and spoke solemnly of truths buried by love, not fear, of a woman not as ghost, but as guardian. Lady Astrid, once Sister Eugenia of Santa Lucia, confessed her role in hiding the manuscript's final page within a music box in her suite. "We thought silence would be safer," she wept. "But memory does not forget." Poirot opened the box himself. Inside lay a single vellum petal inscribed in crimson with names and confessions centuries old, and though there would be no arrests, no trials, he handed it to the captain, saying only, "This is not justice, but it is remembrance, and sometimes that is the beginning." When the Stella Maris docked in Constantinople, Poirot stood alone on deck, watching the sunrise over domes and minarets, a magnolia petal pressed between his notebook's last page. "We do not always solve the mystery," he whispered, "but we must always hear its echo." And with that, he disappeared into the morning crowd, already forgotten by those who had shared his table, never knowing they had stood within the hush of a story not meant to be remembered, only mourned. It began, as such things often do, with an arrival cloaked in elegance and silence. The Orchidea, a luxury steamliner bound from Marseille to Alexandria, was already 2 days into her voyage when the man appeared, as if conjured from mist. No one had seen him board. The purser gave his name as Mr. Adrien Volney, though the ship's manifest bore no such record. He carried no luggage, and wore a velvet coat the color of midnight rain. His manner was polite, soft-spoken, but distant, and notably, he never turned his back to the salon mirror. On the third evening, under an indigo sky bruised with sea wind, he sat once more in the orchid room, a quiet salon perfumed with old books and dying orchids. Hercule Poirot, meticulous and always aware of patterns others ignored, observed the man's eyes, dark, unreadable pools, and felt, deep in his orderly bones, that something had entered their voyage which did not belong. The next morning, the orchid room was shuttered. A discreet note on the doorknob read, "Temporarily out of order," and though the words were polite, Poirot caught the sharp scent of disquiet beneath them. By noon, whispers floated among the passengers. A fainting spell, a seizure, a collapse. But when Captain Favreau summoned Poirot at sunset, there was no longer any question of rumor. Adrien Volney had been found slumped in the orchid room, lifeless on the chaise longue, a delicate trail of blood at the corner of his lips, and a single crumbling orchid petal resting in his palm like the last sigh of something long forgotten. Poirot studied the stillness of the room. Nothing broken, no overturned chair, no cry reported. "It is not the blood that troubles me," he murmured, his voice barely rising above the creak of the ship, "but the silence. Sudden death always echoes, but here it is as if the room itself swallowed the moment." The passengers formed their own fog of intrigue. Poirot observed them carefully. The aging German clockmaker with eyes like ticking brass, a reclusive Contessa, Italian, whose black lace whispered rumors of buried husbands, a French novelist who collected maritime tragedies like pressed flowers, and Mrs. Selina Worthing, a widow dressed in perpetual mourning, who wore around her wrist a silver watch that had not ticked in 2 decades. That evening, Poirot shared supper with Mrs. Worthing and found her speech measured, her hands trembling faintly when the name Volney arose. "It is never the stranger who destroys," she said softly, her gaze distant, but the familiar face we dared to trust. Poirot made no reply, only tucked her words into the growing mosaic in his mind. Volney's cabin, when finally opened, gave up very little. No books, no clothing, no sign of a life lived, save for a locked valise under the bunk. Within, Poirot discovered papers written in cipher, tiny vials marked in faded Cyrillic, and a stained daguerreotype of a woman before a crumbling theater in Odessa, her face marred, her eyes scratched out with something sharp. That night, a storm rose fierce and screaming. Amid the roar, someone slipped into the orchid room again. Nothing had been stolen, but something had changed. The orchid in the glass terrarium, withered for days, now stood tall, pale, and strangely blooming, despite the howling wind beyond the hull. Later, in the ship's boiler room, a scorched slip of paper was found tucked between steaming pipes. It bore a single word, Lena. No such name appeared on the passenger or crew lists. Yet one steward swore he had seen a woman, an older stewardess with drowning star eyes, scrubbing the upper decks 3 nights before. She was dismissed last season, he insisted, and yet she had been there. Poirot's sense for the invisible began to stir. That evening, the German clockmaker was found unconscious near the orchid room, a tiny brass gear, a piece from his own collection, pressed into his palm like a warning or a riddle. Poirot visited the Contessa in her room, where time had curled inward like cigarette smoke. Her suite smelled of rosewater and resignation. Yes, she admitted, she had known a man like Volney once, long ago, but he was not called that then. He had been a boy in Florence, a forger's son, talented, deceitful, wrapped in scandal and shadow. "Some men," she said, almost wistfully, "do not stay buried. They are the bones beneath every house we think is safe." Poirot understood. This mystery did not begin on the Orchidea. It was merely ending here, amid old ghosts and salt air. Returning to the orchid room alone, Poirot examined a wall frame he had noted before, its contents too pristine, too deliberate. Carefully, he removed the backing. Behind the false print was a hidden sheet of trembling parchment. It was a confession. It named Adrien Volney as the architect of an old betrayal, the forging of documents, the sale of a child, and the reinvention of a noble lineage. It spoke of crushed flowers in prayer books, of train tracks dark with blood, and of a child's name spoken only in nightmares. Poirot folded the letter. The orchid in the corner seemed to droop, listening. Mrs. Selina Worthing had vanished from public view. Her cabin was locked. When forced open, she was found seated at her desk, her ink-stained fingers moving in a strange rhythm. In her diary, a single line was written again and again. He remembered me. A small laudanum bottle stood beside the inkwell. She was barely alive, though her pulse returned under the ship's doctor's care. Poirot sat beside her, unmoving, then finally whispered, "You did not mean to kill the man. Only the memory." Her eyes did not rise, but her silence deepened, and that was answer enough. In the final days of the voyage, truth drifted quietly into shape. Whodunit had stolen many lives across his path, names, fates, legacies. He had once ruined a woman so completely that her only revenge was to haunt him in silence. She had waited, hidden in plain sight, until the orchid bloomed again. Each token, the gear, the flower, the image, had been a signal. The orchid room itself had belonged to her once, aboard a different vessel under a different sky. She had summoned justice not with law or blade, but with time. When the orchidea finally arrived in Alexandria, the sky was the shade of dying roses. Poirot stood on deck, his gloves folded neatly, watching the harbor grow clearer in the dawn haze. There would be no trial, no official blame, only the memory of a story quietly concluded. He handed the captain a letter for the authorities, but it bore no accusation. "Only a remembrance," Poirot said, and the captain did not ask more. The orchid room was shuttered for good. In his journal, Poirot pressed the last fallen petal between two pages. "Justice," he wrote, "is sometimes not a gavel, but the echo of a forgotten voice, and the mercy of understanding what should never be spoken again." The sea lay still as silk the night. The Celestine dropped anchor in Veretta Bay, moonlight brushing the Baroque rooftops with a ghostly silver sheen, while Hercule Poirot, sipping chamomile tea with meticulous ritual from his wicker deck chair, indulged in the rare quiet of an Adriatic voyage. But serenity was always fleeting, especially where shadows wore human shapes. Just before midnight, a private launch arrived, depositing 3 cloaked passengers aboard. Lady Viola Darcy, a faded English heiress with a name like tarnished lace, her companion, the pale and silent Miss Eleonora Thorne, and Dr. Joseph Ravick, a Balkan surgeon with eyes like worn glass. They vanished below deck as if never there, save for a silent witness, Poirot, his gaze sharp beneath the brim of his hat. By morning, the ship whispered with fresh unease. Rumor swirled of a missing man, a 4th companion unlisted by name, last seen entering Sweet Sea wearing an amber-tinted monocle. The cabin stood untouched, hauntingly vacant. Poirot's inquiries met a veil of silence until Miss Thorne, pale and wistful beside the rail, confessed softly. He was her brother, but not in any name you'd find written. Hours later, beneath an antique mirror in the viewing gallery, the mystery deepened. A man's body curled like a question mark, one eye open, the other hidden behind shattered amber glass. Though Dr. Ravick declared a heart attack, Poirot scented bitter almond in the air and suspicion in the stillness. In Lady Darcy's quarters, a mutilated portrait hinted at family ghosts, while a hidden sprig of belladonna in the ship's herbarium confirmed to Poirot that poisons, like secrets, are planted long before they bloom. Then came the tapestry, a relic from the ship's private collection, which concealed a faded note beneath its stitched surface, a whisper of betrayal, exile, and a debt unpaid. The dead man hadn't been admiring art, Poirot knew now. He'd been hunting something lost in plain sight. When the ship docked briefly, Antonin Severac, a reclusive composer of operas steeped in madness and memory, joined the voyage. His suite was soon ransacked, a lullaby manuscript missing. "I knew the man with the amber glass," Severac admitted. "We shared a war, a woman, but I never gave him what he came for." Poirot's thoughts turned grim. A storm lashed the Adriatic, and in its aftermath, the ship's chapel stood disturbed, its altar cloth disheveled, a brass cross gone, and Miss Thorne found unconscious with a rosary in her grasp, murmuring, "He wore the wrong ring." The chaplain, visibly shaken, revealed the dead man had confessed days earlier, speaking of a girl who once sang in Veretta's cathedral, a girl lost to time and promises broken before the stone floor had cooled. Below the captain's quarters, Poirot discovered an alabaster casket broken open, revealing a brooch fashioned of onyx and garnet, a twin to the one in Lady Darcy's disfigured portrait. A fire long ago had supposedly claimed her sister, and that brooch. But ashes, Poirot thought, never tell the full truth. In a final reckoning beneath the same mirror, where death had arrived, Poirot revealed the truth stitched in silence. Lady Darcy, who loved her sister beyond forgiveness; Dr. Ravick, who forged her death; Miss Thorne, once the girl in the chancel now bound by guilt; and the monocled man, a collector of secrets and sins, lured aboard not for vengeance, but remembrance. He was not killed by poison, Poirot declared, but by the past. Belladonna masked the truth, but it was fear that finished him. And Lady Darcy, he turned, you only held the door open. She did not flinch. The past walked through by itself. When the Celestine arrived in Dubrovnik under a sky the color of faded ink, the monocle and brooch were placed in the ship's archive, tucked away like dangerous relics. Lady Darcy never left her suite again, requesting only a view of the sea. Poirot, notebook closed, mused aloud. Justice is not always the pointing of a finger, but the knowing of where everything began. That evening, as the ship sailed into open water, Poirot passed the mirror once more. For a breathless moment, a reflection not his own flickered across the glass, a high-collared figure, the gleam of amber glinting from one eye. And then, as all things past do, it vanished. He rested his palm against the glass and whispered, "The past is never dead. It waits for silence, and for someone willing to truly see." Behind him, the ship sailed on, and beneath, as always, the sea kept its secrets folded in the deep. As the ardent bell glided through the placid waters of the Adriatic, twilight settled like silk over the horizon. The sea turned to violet glass, mirroring the lavender haze above, while the limestone cliffs of Montoro loomed in quiet majesty. The ship's lounge bore the hush of day's end, and Hercule Poirot sat impeccably composed at a terrace table, a demitasse of espresso nestled between his fingertips. Yet his eyes did not follow the sea, but rather its reflection in the brass lamp beside him, as though he trusted more the memory of the waves than the water itself. Nearby, Lady Halberdine, a widow with aristocratic cheekbones and a lapdog of imperious temperament, was embroiled in a discussion about antique figurines and their outrageous shipping fees. The stillness broke when a tall, red-haired man entered silently, his linen suit rumpled and his brow furrowed with distracted thought. A steward handed him a telegram. The man read it once, blinked twice, and then dropped his teacup, which shattered on the floor. That was how Basil Kettering introduced himself to the unfolding mystery, not with words, but with the sound of porcelain and a telegram's unspoken weight. Later that evening, the ship had anchored in Montoro Bay, and Poirot was summoned by Captain Renard. Kettering had failed to appear for dinner, and when his locked cabin door was forced open, they discovered him unconscious beside his desk, his breathing shallow, a fine cut on his temple, and a shred of gold leaf clutched in his hand like a relic. Nothing else appeared disturbed. Only a single page had been torn from a 16th-century psalter, a sacred manuscript Kettering had been restoring. The rest remained untouched, but the mirror on the cabin wall had been turned inward. Poirot studied it with quiet intensity. "Why turn the mirror to the wall?" he murmured, "unless one fears what it might reflect." By morning, speculation had spread among the passengers, like perfume in warm air. Poirot ate breakfast alone until Lady Halberdine approached, requesting a discreet word. Her manner was theatrical, carefully constructed. She confessed that she had known Kettering, years ago, in a more ornamental season of life. "He once sold my husband an illuminated bestiary," she said, her spoon dancing in her coffee. "A curious man, always half in shadow, as if afraid full daylight would cost him something." Poirot inquired whether she still owned the book, and she answered too quickly that it had been stolen in Algiers. Poirot filed this away with the neat precision of a banker tallying debts. Later, in the reading salon, he encountered Celia Farnese, a young Italian woman whose ink-stained fingers betrayed her as a bookmaker, though she claimed to be cataloging Venetian texts for a Florentine university. When pressed, she admitted Kettering had promised her a name, the name of a lost scribe whose unfinished manuscript had haunted her research for 6 long years. That evening, Poirot examined the Psalter by lamplight. The torn page bore Psalm 130. Out of the depths have I cried unto thee, O Lord. The handwriting was uneven, rushed, as though inscribed by a trembling hand. Soot lined its edges, and when tilted under light, mica glittered faintly, suggesting a newer form of gilding, not typical of 16th century Italy. Captain Renard, observing, suggested it might be a forgery, but Poirot shook his head. Not forged, revised. Someone altered history, then wrapped it in authenticity. And then Kettering stirred. His voice was hoarse, fragmented, and he spoke of a shadow in his room, of a voice whispering a name, of a match being struck, and then nothing. The following morning, Poirot disembarked with the other passengers into the terraced hills of Montoro, where an old Benedictine abbey had been converted into a vineyard. There he met Brother Anselmo, a serene man with a gaze like sea-weathered stone. When shown a sketch of the Psalter page, the monk crossed himself. Iacopo Vecchietti, he whispered, a scribe accused of heresy. They say his final manuscript bore a curse for any who dared alter it. Poirot did not believe in curses, but he did believe in the lengths to which men would go to preserve illusions, and in the even greater lengths they'd go to reclaim a past lost to time. Returning to the ship, Poirot confronted Celia with the monk's revelation. Her face paled. Iacopo was my ancestor, she confessed. His last work vanished during the war. Basil said he had found it, was restoring it for me. Poirot nodded gravely, then returned to Kettering's cabin. Inside the lining of the manuscript's case, he discovered a hidden page, new, yet artificially aged, the ink not yet fully set. It bore Iacopo's name in a familiar hand. He rewrote history, Poirot murmured, but history is not clay. It resists reshaping. That night, as the Adriatic glowed gold beneath the retreating sun, Kettering was found dead in his berth, a faint smile ghosting across his lips, an empty bottle of digitalis at his side. When told, Celia collapsed, but Poirot noted her tears fell not on the memory of the man, but on the parchment of a letter. He gave me the name, she whispered, but it was false. A fiction to placate me. A final deception. At twilight, Poirot gathered the key passengers in the lounge, with the same lilac light that had embraced Montoro now spilled through the windows like the breath of some fading dream. Basil Kettering died twice. Poirot began, voice soft and measured. First, when he abandoned the truth for ambition. Then, last night, by his own hand. But he was not the only one who manipulated shadows. He turned to Lady Halberdine. The bestiary you claimed was stolen. You sold it, to cover debts. You feared Kettering might expose you. Then to Celia. Your grief was not for him, but for the name you did not receive. And in your hunger, you became his accomplice, pressing him toward a mirage. He paused, letting silence speak. The most perilous treasures are not buried in earth, but in memory. And memory, M.E.S. Amos, is a most treacherous manuscript. That night, Poirot stood again before the ship's mirrored wall, now polished clean. He gazed not at himself, but at the invisible imprint of those who had pursued ghosts through gilded lies. In the glass he saw not reflections, but silhouettes. Lady Halberdine's practiced remorse, Celia's ink-stained ambition, Kettering's tragic folly. He touched the cool surface with the gentlest gesture. To seek truth, he whispered, is a noble calling, but to demand it wear the costume of our desire, that is where tragedy begins. And as the ardent bell sailed on beneath the fading lilac sky, the cursed manuscript lay sealed below deck, not lost, not cursed, merely unreadable to those who had forgotten how to see. The bell of St. Luke struck thrice that autumn evening in Marseille, its bronze tolling echoing across the harbor like a judgment whispered too late. From the upper deck of the Étoile du Levant, Hercule Poirot watched the light fade behind the crooked skyline. Fog crept in from the sea with an almost religious hush, blanketing the ship's lanterns in soft halos. He wore his evening suit with the poise of an old statue, every inch of him polished and contained, save for his eyes, which carried a question they would not yet speak aloud. The harbor bustled below with stevedores and barking sailors, but the passengers aboard ship had gathered quietly in the observation lounge for a peculiar event, the reading of a will. Madame Clarice Lavalier, famed bibliophile, collector of condemned manuscripts, and recluse of Provence, had died aboard the ship just a day before reaching Alexandria. Her solicitor, Monsieur Dupin, pale and composed, now stood at the lounge's marble lectern. He cleared his throat and read with a gravity more suited to a chapel than a cruise liner. The will was brief, but its final clause raised eyebrows and blood pressure alike. To whomever may solve the final cipher within the manuscript de verite, Dupin intoned, I leave my entire collection of forbidden texts, provided they do not perish in the attempt. A soft gasp fluttered through the crowd. Poirot, ever still, adjusted his boutonniere. Madame Lavalier's final manuscript, a codex whispered about in occult corners, said to have driven more than one reader into delirium, was missing. Stolen, it seemed, within the very hour of her death. Captain Armand Lefebvre, a man with salt-stiffened cuffs and the gaze of a storm watcher, led Poirot and a few concerned passengers to Lavalier's stateroom. Her body remained where it had been found, seated, upright in her armchair, hands resting peacefully atop an unopened book in her lap. Her expression was not one of agony, nor surprise, but a curious serenity, as if she had glimpsed something beyond the veil and found it neither cruel nor kind, merely final. Poirot knelt beside the chair. He touched the book without opening it. It is blank, he murmured. The page is empty, and yet her fingers mark them like prayer. The manuscript, it seemed, had been replaced with a decoy, an identical leather-bound volume, devoid of ink. A cruel jest, or a calculated deception. Dr. Mallory, the ship's physician, could find no immediate cause of death, no signs of poison nor trauma. Her heart simply ceased. Poirot studied the room. The single candle burned low. No struggle, no disarray, only a scent, a faint aroma of crushed violets and ink. Among the passengers was a strange pair, Isadora Bellamy, a poet of dwindling fame, and Charles Rutledge, a nervous English historian. Their connection to Lavalier was not immediately known. Over coffee, Isadora admitted they had come to deliver an anonymous fragment, a passage they believed to be part of the fabled manuscript de verite. She had promised to verify its authenticity, Isadora said, voice brittle. But more than that, she promised truth. Not just history, but the kind one feels in their marrow. Charles added, she spoke of the morning hour, an apocryphal ritual in the manuscript that is said to allow communion with lost things. Poirot studied them both. Grief and longing are lovers of memory, he thought, and memory is the most deceptive witness. Poirot requested the passenger logs, staff reports, and maintenance schedules from Captain Lefebvre. The captain obliged, handing over the ship's meticulous ledger. One entry stood out. At 2:17 a.m., the night of Lavalier's death, a crewman had reported a flickering light in the archive chamber, an area sealed to passengers and located directly beneath Lavalier's suite. Poirot descended with the steward. The chamber was cool still. Dozens of crates bore the sigil of Lavalier's estate. One, unsealed, contained velvet pouches meant for handling delicate manuscripts. Another, oddly clean, bore faint traces of wax and parchment ash. He found a scrap tucked between floorboards, a single torn corner of vellum, blackened at the edge, bearing one word in blood-colored ink, Reveler. To reveal, Poirot returned to the lounge, where passengers lingered in uneasy silence. He gathered the known scholars and bibliophiles aboard, including the poetess Isadora, the historian Rutledge, a Spanish theologian named Padre Solano, and an aloof Russian calligrapher, Elena Kirova. He presented them with the scrap. Padre Solano paled. It's not just a cipher, he said softly. It's the opening to the confession of verite. The manuscript is structured like a sacrament. If one reads it aloud, believing in its authority, they undergo something irreversible. Madness? Rutledge asked. Not always, but never balance, Solano replied. It is not a book, Monsieur Poirot. It is an offering. That evening, Poirot sat alone in the ship's library, examining the books Lavalier had last consulted. One, an obscure volume on mirror rituals in Renaissance France, bore a handwritten annotation. Only in morning is one granted the eye of truth. Poirot requested the glass from Lavalier's stateroom be retrieved. Upon its surface, under specific light and angle, he observed faint smudges forming the shape of a sentence, invisible to the naked eye. The morning hour is now. He turned to the steward. She saw something, he said, almost to himself, and someone ensured it would not be spoken. Captain Lefebvre disclosed that the ship had one unusual architectural feature, a reflection room, built decades earlier by a former owner obsessed with silence and self-contemplation. It was rarely used, hidden near the bow, and fitted entirely in black stone and mirrors. Poirot gathered the key passengers there under protest. Within, he orchestrated a reenactment, replacing the blank book with a hidden facsimile created from Isadora and Rutledge's fragment. Poirot read aloud its opening verse. To those whose grief is unrepented, speak not this right, for mourning is not silence, but exposure. Suddenly, Elena Kirova shrieked. Stop! You do not understand what you summon. She confessed. She had stolen the manuscript, not to profit, but to protect others. Lavalier summoned things, Elena whispered, trembling. Her knowledge was not cold, it burned. She read until she stopped sleeping, until the voices whispered even in light. She feared silence, Poirot said quietly, and silence, too, feared her. Elena had hidden the true manuscript in the ship's ballast chamber, where moisture had ruined half the text. It was recovered, sealed, and delivered to authorities in Alexandria. Poirot advised it be archived without translation, sealed like a prayer unanswered. Later, on deck beneath stars dulled by fog, Poirot turned to Hastings. There are truths, mon ami, that illuminate, but there are others, like sudden lightning, which leave the mind blind and the heart scorched. Hastings nodded. So what is justice in this case? Poirot smiled faintly. To leave the dead their secrets, and the living their illusions. The Etoile du Levant docked in Alexandria as the sky turned a strange ochre, a light too gold to be morning, too dim to be dusk. Passengers disembarked with heavier steps than when they'd boarded. Isadora Bellamy remained behind, asking Poirot only one question. Do you believe the morning hour exists? Poirot considered, then answered with great care. Grief, he said, is not a time. It is a threshold. We each decide what we bring with us when we cross it, but some bring too much. He tipped his hat to her and stepped ashore. And somewhere below deck, locked within a lead box, the manuscript waited, no longer threatening, no longer desired, merely unread, like so many truths the world cannot yet bear to know. The sea air and can had that dusky perfume particular to late autumn, salt softened by decaying magnolia and the bitter edge of approaching rain. Hercule Poirot stood upon the balcony of the Hotel Seraphine, observing the narrow lane below, where carriages clattered over cobblestone like dice in a gambler's hand. It was not leisure that had brought him here, but invitation, an unusual letter inscribed with trembling penmanship and bearing no return address. It spoke of secrets buried not in earth but in memory, of injustice long disguised as fate, and of a death whose cause remained obscured beneath the polite veil of suicide. His host, the reclusive art dealer Thaddeus Rainier, had reserved room 13, the hotel's oldest chamber, rumored to have once housed a cardinal fleeing disgrace. Poirot, of course, did not believe in omens, yet he believed in architecture, and there was something unmistakably oppressive in the chamber's proportions. Ceilings too high, window shutters that refused to open fully, and a fireplace bricked shut with the precision of shame. He unpacked his toiletries with usual care, lining them in symmetrical order upon the marble-topped dresser. It was not long before a knock sounded, dry and deliberate. Thaddeus Rainier entered like a man bearing invisible weights. His hair, once black, had thinned to spectral silver, and his cane was more than affectation, it was necessity. Monsieur Poirot, he said, bowing slightly, you come not as a guest, but as a confessor. Poirot inclined his head. And you, monsieur, speak not as a host, but as a man who has run out of lies. They sat by the window, where the fading light struck Rainier's face at such an angle that it hollowed his features like a sculpture eroded by guilt. He explained. 1 month earlier, a young woman named Althea Marchand, a painter's apprentice, had fallen to her death from room 13's balcony, the very room now occupied by Poirot. The police had found a note, poetic and damning, a confession of despair, an admission of romantic failure, open and shut. But Rainier insisted it was staged. Althea had feared heights, hated metaphor, and had, days before her death, sold a painting to Rainier, one she refused to sign. She said names were dangerous. Rainier whispered, that once you sign something, it no longer belongs to you, or the truth. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And what did the painting depict? Rainier hesitated. A man, he said slowly, burning, but not consumed. The following morning brought fog, thick and listless as grief. Poirot descended to the dining room and found it nearly deserted save for a solitary woman in blue silk seated beside the fire. Her hat was impeccable, her gloves pristine, but her gaze wandered the flames as if watching them reenact something only she could see. She introduced herself as Vivian Corbin, once governess to Althea. She had the soul of a cathedral, Vivian said softly, always too large for the room she entered. Poirot inquired gently into Althea's last days. Vivian hesitated. She feared someone, a man who came to the hotel on odd days, never registered. He would leave notes in charcoal beneath her door. Do you possess one? Vivian drew from her purse a folded scrap. Poirot opened it with care. The message was simple. Room 13 reveals what is owed. Hotel staff proved reluctant to speak, but a maid, coaxed by Poirot's quiet intensity, admitted she had smelled burning paper on the night Althea died. Not fire, paper, in the hearth of room 13, bricked and unused. Poirot examined it that evening, finding soot disturbed unnaturally at the base. Behind a loose brick, he discovered remnants. A corner of parchment, ash-covered but bearing traces of pigment. Red, and initials barely visible. T.R. Rainier, when confronted, confessed the initials were his. The painting Althea had sold him. He had destroyed it. It was not just a portrait, he murmured. It was an accusation. The hotel's night porter, once questioned, recalled a man seen exiting the alley near room 13 the night of the death. A tall figure in a green hat, common in Austrian military fashion. Poirot cross-referenced guest lists, invoices, and artist registries. One name emerged, Dieter Kloss, an expatriate and one-time mentor of Althea, a man with a history of volatile affairs. Poirot arranged a meeting through the pretense of art acquisition. Kloss, when confronted, denied romance, but admitted obsession. She was not a student. She was a mirror, he said. She reflected what I was afraid to paint. Poirot returned to room 13 with a lantern and silence. He stripped the walls gently, removing layers of wallpaper. Behind them, scrawled in gesso and ink, were words, lines of poetry and fragments of names. A hidden journal, embedded in plaster. Althea's voice. I see him watching, always from the mirror, but there are no mirrors. And then, I know now why room 13 was sealed. It listens. It repeats. Poirot traced the final layer to a wooden panel. It creaked open to reveal a hidden recess. Inside, another painting. Unfinished. A woman falling, not in agony, but serenity. Her arms folded, as if in sleep. And in the upper corner, Rainier's face, obscured by flame. Poirot summoned Rainier, Vivian, and Kloss. He recited the truth. Althea had discovered an old scandal, Rainier's forged provenance papers from a stolen Austrian collection. She had threatened to expose him. Kloss, fearing her ruin, had tried to dissuade her, but it was Vivian, the devoted governess, who had intervened. She believed in bloodlines, Poirot said gently. She believed scandal would destroy the legacy she helped raise. Vivian wept, not with regret, but exhaustion. I only meant to frighten her. I slipped into her room, left the charcoal notes. The rest, I did not foresee. She stood on that balcony, and I believe she chose the silence. Poirot ensured no charges were filed. There had been no murder, only a slow orchestration of fear. yet he insisted room 13 be decommissioned. "There are places," he said to the concierge, "that remember, not what was said, but what was meant, and they echo." As Poirot left the Hotel Seraphine, he looked once more at the shuttered window above. Behind it, perhaps, memory coiled like smoke, not malevolent, but not benign. In the carriage, Hastings asked quietly, "Do you believe in haunted rooms, Poirot?" Poirot smiled without mirth. "I believe," he said, "in haunted hearts." And as the rain began, soft as morning, the detective withdrew his watch, adjusted it precisely, and whispered into the fog, "There's no time for regret, only for truth, however late it arrives." The sun, shrouded by a haze of coastal mist, hung like a fading coin over the sea as Hercule Poirot stepped from the narrow motorcar that had borne him up the winding cliffs of Crete. Before him stood Argo's house, a villa of pale stone and darker rumors, its shuttered windows set deep as closed eyes and a tired face. The invitation had come weeks earlier, a formal, almost desperate letter from a retired British naval commander named Edwin Lytton, now master of the house, and its memories. The letter had spoken vaguely of unsettled matters and a past that refused burial. Poirot, though retired in name only, had accepted with the quiet gravity of a man who knew that truth rarely rests peacefully in graves. Argo's house was a place of peculiar quiet. A chill breeze stirred olive branches like reluctant confessions. A servant, young and mute, gestured him silently through the stone hallways, into a drawing-room thick with damask and dust. Commander Lytton stood there already, his right hand resting not on his walking stick, but upon a globe, as if still steering unseen waters. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice salt-roughened, "you come not to investigate a crime, but to prevent one, though which I cannot say." After a modest supper of black olives, bread, and sharp local cheese, Poirot was shown to his quarters. He noted with care the architecture, arches like rib bones, and stairwells that turned not by necessity but by design, as though evading something unseen. Beyond his window, a locked courtyard stretched below, its iron gate rusted and overgrown. "We do not use that garden," said the housekeeper, a lean woman named Mrs. Ellingham, "not since the boy died." Poirot's brows lifted. "Ah," he said, "a tragedy of youth." "A fall," she murmured, "or a jump, or a push. One never truly knows in a house this old." By morning, the house was no longer quiet. Guests had arrived in the night, 6 in total, including Lytton's estranged niece, Mary Ann, who bore the look of one who had learned to smile at ghosts, Dr. Ames, a pale man with trembling fingers, and a young Grecian archivist named Eleni, who had come to catalogue the commander's war journals. Poirot joined them for breakfast, noting the strained civility. Commander Lytton addressed them all. "I have gathered you because I believe the past is not past. There are secrets beneath these stones, and before I die, I must know. Who among you still remembers what they swore to forget?" Gasps were muted. Poirot watched the faces. In Mary Ann, he saw fear cloaked in politeness. In Dr. Ames, guilt made manifest in the clink of silverware. And Eleni, there was curiosity, not fear. Poirot's investigation began in the study, where a letter lay half-written upon the commander's desk. Its contents, an admission of remorse, vague but intense, ending mid-sentence. No envelope, no addressed recipient. "This is not a letter of farewell," Poirot muttered. "It is a confession interrupted." A search of the adjoining rooms revealed a hidden drawer within an antique map cabinet. Inside, a photograph, weathered and curled, of a young man standing beneath the cypress tree in the locked courtyard. On the back, one word, Theo. That evening, a storm rolled in from the Aegean, pressing the house beneath its weight. By candlelight, Poirot examined the commander's journals, dense with naval codes and riddled with symbols. Eleni aided him, translating a passage that referenced the key buried with the forgotten son. "Theo was the commander's son?" Poirot asked. Eleni shook her head. "He never claimed one, but the villagers say otherwise. They say a boy once lived here and vanished." The storm cracked open the sky. Somewhere in the house, a cry rang out. Dr. Ames was found in the bathing chamber, collapsed beside the porcelain tub. Not dead, but near. Beside him, a bottle of laudanum and a journal page soaked through. Poirot, ever meticulous, saved what he could. The ink had bled, but the words "he was my patient, but also my guilt" remained. Poirot confronted him the next morning. "You treated the boy. You failed him." Ames wept silently. "He begged me not to say. Said the commander would deny him. And when the accident happened, I let the silence grow." Poirot requested the courtyard be opened. With rusted keys and reluctant hands, Mrs. Ellingham complied. The cypress tree stood gnarled and solemn. Beneath it, a well long sealed with iron. They pried it open, finding, after hours of labor, a tin box bound in oilcloth. Inside, Theo's final letter, untouched by time. It told of shame, of lineage denied, of whispered warnings, and the threat of being disappeared. The last line read, "I was born in this house, but it has no room for me." That night, Lytton summoned all once more to the drawing room. Poirot, calm and clear, recited the truth. "Theo was your son, born of war and circumstance. You hid him to protect your name, and when he begged to be seen, you let others silence him." Lytton bowed his head. "I loved him," he whispered. "But love that fears shame is not love. It is cowardice." Marianne stood. "I remember him. He gave me a bird carved from driftwood. I kept it hidden. I was afraid, too." Poirot prepared to depart. Eleni handed him the translated cipher from the journals. It referenced an account, a will rewritten in secret. The commander had changed everything in his final weeks. Argo's house would be converted into a refuge for orphan children. Theo's name would be etched on the fountain newly planned for the courtyard. As Poirot stepped into the dawn, Hastings asked, "Do you believe in family, Poirot, even when it hides its own?" Poirot adjusted his cuffs, eyes on the mist. "I believe in justice, mon ami. And justice, like blood, will find its way to the surface." Weeks later, a young girl skipped through the courtyard where Theo once stood. The cypress tree cast a gentler shadow now, and in the echo of its leaves, perhaps, the house remembered not only sorrow, but hope. And far away, in a quiet carriage, Hercule Poirot closed his notebook and whispered, "To forget is simple. To forgive, that is the true labor of the heart." The sea pressed itself against the jagged Norman cliffs, as if trying to prise open the secrets buried within the quiet village of St. Avellini, a place so withdrawn from the world that even its church bells sounded like echoes from another century. Hercule Poirot, immaculate as always in his gray wool coat and polished shoes, arrived not by invitation to a party nor summons to a crime scene, but at the urgent request of a solicitor named Talland. The Count Renard de Belloun had died in solitude, and though no foul play had yet been declared, the solicitor's eyes, shadowed and evasive, hinted at a darker inheritance. In the wind-blown churchyard, beneath the shadow of a bell said to have tolled only once in 50 years, on the day of a long-forgotten tragedy, Talland greeted Poirot with a whisper, "We are not here to investigate a murder. Not yet, but I fear one has been invited." Within the creaking grandeur of Belloun Manor, time had ossified. The air was stale with secrets, and portraits stared from the walls with the authority of the unforgiven. It was here that Talland produced a strange and unsigned will, hidden among the Count's effects, a will that named not the known heir, Alaric de Belloun, but an unknown woman, Celeste d'Arquez, a woman no one in the family would acknowledge, a woman now vanished. Poirot's inquiries led him to Madame Duret, the Count's aging housekeeper, whose voice trembled as she confessed that her master had often spoken to someone late at night, alone in the study, but with the intimacy of conversation. And once, only once, she had seen her, a woman in white, with eyes like smoke, drifting near the ruined bell tower before vanishing like frost on glass. The mystery grew more entangled with the arrival of the Count's surviving relations. Alaric, brittle and aristocratic, accompanied by his calculating wife, dismissed Celeste as a long-dead servant girl and the Count's senile fantasy. But Elise Renard, a distant cousin with poetic leanings and a hollow smile, offered another possibility. The Count had loved Celeste, and in secret. She claimed to have read about her in an old journal once kept in the manor, until it was hidden away. Poirot, meticulous as ever, discovered the journal beneath a false drawer in the Count's escritoire. It spoke of passion restrained by class and cowardice, of a promise to meet at the bell tower and flee, but a promise unkept. The Count had sent Celeste away, for honor, for fear, for reputation. And in that cowardice, something had died that never came back. That night the bell, silent for decades, tolled once. The household awoke in terror. There was no wind, no storm, yet the bell had rung. Poirot ascended the tower alone and found nothing disturbed, except a pinned note, yellowed and strange. It is not inheritance that binds us, but guilt. In the attic, behind discarded relics, he found a portrait. Celeste, young and defiant, her eyes defying time. Hidden behind the canvas was a letter she had written in 1944, revealing that she had indeed come to the tower as promised, and waited in vain. Heartbroken, she left, not in hatred but in sorrow. She had seen the Count for what he was, a man who spoke of love, but chose legacy. The next morning, the bell rang again, and Elise was found dead at its base. Her neck snapped, her expression twisted in fear. Poirot gathered them all. Elise had been lured. The bell, he revealed, had been rigged with a pulley system, cleverly controlled from the stables, its tolling not supernatural, but calculated. The killer sought to recreate a legend, Poirot said, to frighten, to eliminate, to ensure the will was dismissed as the fancy of a madman. But Celeste was no ghost. She lived. She changed her name. She had a daughter. All eyes turned to Madame Duret, who trembled as the past pulled her down. She confessed not to murder, but to concealment. Celeste had been her sister's child. When the Count cast her aside, she had taken Celeste in. Later, when Celeste died unknown in a convent hospital, her own daughter, Lucien Duret, had returned to this house in silence, unaware of the inheritance sealed by shame. Poirot held up the authenticated will, signed and dated in secret by the Count, leaving the entire estate not to prideful relatives, but to Lucien. The house had buried its guilt long enough. Justice, Poirot declared, is not always loud. Sometimes it arrives softly, like a bell rung once, and never again. The bell was taken down, its mouth turned toward the earth, and Saint Aveline began to breathe again. Lucien, quiet and thoughtful, opened the manor as a sanctuary for artists and lost children. And as Poirot departed on the morning train, Hastings, who had arrived late in the week, asked him what he thought of legacy. Poirot replied without turning, "Legacy, mon ami, is not what we leave in vaults or portraits. It is how others speak our names when we are no longer listening. And some names, at last, deserve to be spoken with peace." The mist lay thick over the Loire Valley that morning, rolling like breath over a mirror. Hercule Poirot stood at the gates of Château de Verre, an estate once famed for its mirrored halls and decadent gatherings, now fallen into quiet ruin. He had come at the request of Madame Noël Varin, a reclusive widow whose letter bore a curious postscript. The clock in the west wing cries at midnight, "Bring only yourself and the patience for ghosts." Poirot, though not superstitious, had learned long ago that behind every ghost was a shadow with a human origin. The great double doors groaned as they opened, revealing Madame Varin, tall, silver-haired, and pale as morning linen. "Monsieur Poirot," she said softly, her voice edged with something close to fear. "Thank you for coming. My husband has been dead for 5 years, and yet I believe he is trying to speak." The household gathered that evening like chess pieces across a velvet board. There was Julien Varin, the late husband's younger brother, a failed painter with an acid tongue and wandering eyes. Celeste, Madame Varin's niece, vibrant and modern, whose presence clashed jarringly with the chateau's sorrowful decor. And lastly, Father Madieu, the village priest, whose visits had grown more frequent since the noises began. Over a quiet supper beneath the stained-glass windows of the dining hall, Madame Varin recounted the occurrences. A ticking sound from the west, wing long after the ancient grandfather clock had stopped working, footsteps in the ballroom dust, and most disturbingly, the faint, steady weeping that came only at midnight. "We thought it the wind at first," she said, "but no wind leaves wet footprints." Poirot inspected the west wing the following morning. The grandfather clock stood still, its hands frozen at 12:03. The floor beneath it was undisturbed, save for a faint, salty stain on the marble. Tears, perhaps, though logic resisted the notion. The room beyond the clock, a former study, had long been sealed. No key remained. Yet at midnight, as Madame Varenne had warned, the house echoed with muffled sobs, and Poirot, stationed by the door, noted the moment the clock began to tick again. It ticked 12 times, and on the final chime, silence fell like a shroud. The next morning, the study door stood open. No one confessed to unlocking it. Within the study, Poirot found a scene both untouched and violated. Books lay in perfect rows, dust-coated but orderly. Yet one painting, a large oil portrait of the late Monsieur Varenne, had been vandalized. The eyes were slashed away with surgical precision. Beneath the portrait, a curious item, a miniature music box, silver, shaped like a clock tower. Inside a note. J.E. voiced out, Meme après la mort. I see all, even after death. The handwriting matched no sample Poirot had yet seen. But what caught his attention more was the small brass mechanism tucked inside the box. Receiver. A device meant not for music, but for transmission. A visit to the nearby village led Poirot to the workshop of Marcel Dupont, an aging clockmaker who had once serviced the Varenne clocks. Ah, the clock in the West Wing, he said, puffing his pipe. Built in 1812. Very complex. Too complex. Monsieur Varenne had it rewired just before he died. Wanted a secret added. Something poetic. I refused. It was his apprentice who did the work. Young man. Quiet. Nervous. Drowned in the river a week later. Poirot's brows tightened. And the mechanism? Some kind of timer. Dupont shrugged. He said it would play music if someone opened the study at the wrong hour. A warning, maybe. Or a confession. Celeste, restless and insomniac, confided to Poirot that she often heard the sounds not from the West Wing, but from beneath the ballroom floor. This led him to the old servant passages, long unused. There, beneath loose floorboards and rotting beams, Poirot found a tangle of old wires leading to a panel, marked with initials. JV inside were tapes. Recordings. Of arguments. Confessions. One, particularly chilling, ended with a desperate voice. If you take her from me, I will unmake all of this. Poirot now understood. The weeping clock was a performance, a programmed confession, set to trigger long after the speaker could be accused. But who was the accused? And who the thief of hearts? Julien Varenne was found dead the next morning, not violently, but in a chair, a wineglass spilled beside him, and a look of profound relief upon his face. No poison, no wound, merely an ending. But Poirot found something else in Julien's pocket, a small key. It fit the music box, and inside, now visible with the key's release, was a final scrap of paper. Forgive me. I did not know how to love without possession. Poirot summoned the household once more. Before the fire, Poirot laid bare the truth. Monsieur Varenne had suspected his brother of infidelity, not with his wife, but with his muse, Celeste's mother. The clock was his revenge, designed to haunt Julien into confession. Yet Julien had discovered the device after Varenne's death, modified it, made it more poetic. The crying clock, the open door, the slashed painting, all the work of a man unraveling. Julien had tried to forget, but guilt is the most faithful timekeeper. It wakes you always at the hour you most wish to forget. His death was natural, yes, a broken heart released. And the final piece? The recordings were not just to trap a killer. They were to protect the truth, that Varenne himself had loved not wisely, but obsessively. Celeste was his daughter, and he had hidden it from them all. The clock was dismantled, the study sealed once more. Poirot stood with Madame Varenne in the misty garden. "Why did you come, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked. He looked toward the chateau, now hollow, with secrets spent. "Because when the dead cry, madame, someone must listen." As he boarded the train that would take him east, Poirot fingered a small trinket in his pocket. The music box bell, now tongueless. Hastings, returning from a delayed journey, sat beside him and asked gently, "Did you solve it, Poirot? Did you catch the ghost?" Poirot smiled faintly, eyes distant. Non mon ami. But I gave it peace. Behind them, the chateau shrank into fog, and in its silence, at last, time held its breath. A veil of mist clung to the harbors of Smyrna as the SS Caledonia sat idle at anchor, awaiting clearance from the port authority. Hercule Poirot, immaculate in white linen and silk, stood at the deck rail, surveying the slow dawn with narrowed eyes. A light breeze carried the scent of salt, tar, and faintly, cigar smoke. But not just any cigar. Amberleaf, a rare Balkan blend Poirot recognized instantly. A moment later, he spotted its source, a tall man in a Panama hat, watching the water with too much intent for so early an hour. Poirot's little gray cells stirred. Something about the man's posture bespoke both patience and threat. Moments later, a steward delivered a letter to Poirot's cabin. It bore no signature, only a message written in an elegant, trembling hand. If smoke rises tonight from the Chimera Lounge, he is watching. And if he is watching, one of us will die. By evening, the lounge was filled with the usual assembly of first-class passengers. The walls shimmered with golden wallpaper and Greek mosaics, and a quartet played something moody and unresolved. Lady Danforth, the famed Egyptologist, sipped her violet liqueur with the air of a woman hiding something behind each blink. To her left lounged Colonel Morland, a man who had fought in 3 wars and spoken of none. Near the piano sat Miss Imelda Keene, a governess with a hidden fire, and young Maxim Petrov, the Slavic pianist whose hands danced like ghosts across ivory keys. But it was the scent that warned Poirot, the unmistakable, sickly sweet curl of amber cigar smoke. It hung in the air though no one smoked. Poirot rose, walked to the far corner, and found there, ashes still warm, in an antique incense dish never meant for tobacco. Someone had been watching. The letter had told the truth. The next morning, the ship buzzed with hushed voices and unspoken questions. Miss Keene was found collapsed on the promenade, her skin pale and her breath labored. She survived, but only barely, and with no memory of the night before. A small crystal vial had been discovered beside her, its contents indeterminate, but faintly scented of almonds. Poirot stood with the ship's doctor in silence, then bent to examine the railing. A faint smear of blood, a torn thread of silk, a footprint too large for Imelda's dainty slippers. Someone had approached her unseen. Poirot's mind turned not only to murder, but to the stage. This had all the marks of a performance, and the audience was still among them. Lady Danforth, visibly shaken, approached Poirot that afternoon. "Monsieur Poirot, I must speak with you in confidence." She led him to her cabin and, with trembling hands, produced a small fragment of parchment. "This," she whispered, "was stolen from the tomb of Aucassin. My late husband believed it cursed, but I think someone believes it to be valuable. I found it torn and tucked into my dressing table yesterday." Poirot examined the parchment, a map fragment, or perhaps a cipher. The ink shimmered slightly, as though treated with oil. "Lady Danforth, who knew you carried this?" Her silence was telling. "Only one person, a man I thought long dead. He once went by the name of Mr. Grinlow, but now he smokes amber cigars." Captain Albrecht confirmed Poirot's suspicions. A man boarded at Smyrna, without documentation, bribed his way on, claimed he was a steward. Poirot requested access to the crew manifest and cross-referenced names, arriving at a blank space, a gap no one had noticed until it was too late. Below deck, in the storage compartments, Poirot discovered a makeshift nest, an unmade cot, cigar butts, and a journal with 3 pages torn out. But the final page was intact and chilling. She kept it. The map. "I will take it from her, as I took the others. The smoke will rise when I am near." The phantom was not a myth. He was aboard, and he had killed before. Poirot returned to the music room late that evening. Maxim Petrov played a sonata with manic precision, his hands trembling. Poirot watched, noting the shadows beneath the pianist's eyes. After the performance, he approached quietly. "You knew Grinlow once, N.S.C. pas?" Petrov flinched. "I knew a man who called himself Gray. He taught me ciphers. Then he disappeared. I thought he was dead." Poirot leaned in. "And you have seen him again?" A slow nod. "2 nights ago. in the corridor outside Miss Keene's door. He was humming. Poirot pressed for details. A melody, like the one I played. It's from a cipher poem. Each note represents a letter. The map, the music, the poison, threads in one tapestry. Imelda Keene, now recovered enough to speak, revealed the final clue. He spoke to me, she said, voice shaking. I woke up and he was there, his face in shadow. He said I reminded him of someone he had lost. And then he handed me this. She produced a letter written in reverse script, as though meant to be read in a mirror. Poirot read it with a hand mirror from the dressing table. The map leads to ashes. There's no treasure, only memory. If they dig, they will find grief. Poirot understood now. This was not about gold or vengeance. It was a monument of obsession, memory made monstrous. Poirot gathered the passengers in the Chimera lounge that evening. We are not in danger from a thief, or even a madman, he began. We are stalked by a mourner, a man who loved, lost, and could not bear the silence. Grinlow Gray. He was not seeking treasure. He sought remembrance. But memory twisted becomes cruelty. He turned to Lady Danforth. The tomb you desecrated contained not gold, but letters. A final goodbye. And you. He looked to Petrov. You gave the music form. You made grief sing. Then to Imelda. You became her image, and so he spared you. The door opened. The tall man entered, slowly. He removed his hat. You understand, he whispered. Poirot nodded. Yes, but it must end. The man wept and surrendered. The man was arrested quietly. The ship reached Alexandria at dawn. Poirot stood alone on deck, watching the sun climb above the Nile's mouth. Hastings, he murmured to himself. Grief is the most stubborn smoke. It rises when the fire is long gone. He withdrew the mirror letter, folded it once more, and let it slip into the wind. The ashes of memory carried away. That night, the Chimera lounge was empty. The smoke had cleared. The music had stopped. But in the corner, by the antique incense bowl, Poirot saw a single white petal. He picked it up. It bore the faintest scent, not of cigars, but lilies. And in that moment, the great detective felt something he rarely permitted sorrow. He placed the petal in his pocket, and returned to his cabin in silence. The sea air lay thick and damp as the RMS Eurydice made its moonlit approach toward Calypso Reach, a half-forgotten archipelago whose craggy silhouettes rose from the black water like the backs of sleeping beasts. The bell buoy at the mouth of the inlet tolled slowly, though the air was still. Hercule Poirot stood alone on the upper deck, his polished shoes immaculate despite the hour, his gaze fixed not on the water, but the unnatural stillness that seemed to press against the hull. Mon ami, he murmured, though Hastings was not beside him. There is something in this silence that offends the natural order. A shadow moved then, swift and slight, just below the wheelhouse. Poirot turned, but it was gone. That morning, the passengers disembarked onto the grand yet weathered wooden dock of Calypso Reach, where the Retreat Hotel awaited, an edifice of pale stone and dark timber, half-shrouded in ivy, its architecture a curious blend of Venetian melancholy and colonial pride. They were greeted by Madame Rosamond Dervaux, proprietress and widow, whose voice retained the lilt of French nobility, though her eyes were as dry and colorless as driftwood. She welcomed each guest in turn, her gloved hand never touching another's skin. Poirot noted the faint scent of myrrh clinging to her, and filed it away. Dinner that evening unfolded in the solarium, where 12 guests gathered beneath an arched ceiling ribbed with iron and glass. Among them, Mr. Kettering, a reclusive clockmaker with a deep scar across his cheek, Miss Annalise March, a traveling contralto whose voice was said to shatter glass, Reverend Blythe, whose every word seemed dipped in gilt, and Lady Ethelyn North, an antiquarian whose laughter never quite reached her eyes. They were served a meal of unnerving precision, a symmetry in the presentation that spoke more to ritual than nourishment. Poirot observed them as one would rare insects pinned beneath glass. At precisely 4 in the morning, a cry echoed across the retreat, rending the air like a blade. Poirot was already awake, his instincts honed by countless nights, disrupted by just such alarms. He followed the sound to the east wing, where Miss Annalise March stood trembling in her nightdress, pointing toward the half-open door of Madame Dervaux's study. Within, the room was lit only by a dying hearth. On the desk lay an ornate letter opener, bloodied. Behind it a bell, the same as on the buoy, its clapper stained red. But Madame Dervaux was nowhere to be found. Later that morning, Poirot was called to the study by the island's constable, a man too old for his badge, but too proud to set it down. They had found a note in Madame Dervaux's private safe, one that had required 3 separate keys to open. The note was short. The bell tolls not for the lost, but for the liars. Let it toll until the truth is bled from the stone. Poirot took it, held it up to the light. It was written on handmade vellum, the edges singed, as though part of it had been burned or preserved. "Ah," he whispered, "the handwriting of desperation is most often confused with that of revenge." The guests were restless. Poirot began his quiet inquiries, speaking first to Mr. Kettering. The clockmaker revealed that Madame Dervaux had approached him 2 weeks prior with a strange commission, a clock whose hands moved not forward but backward, whose hourly chime was modeled after a bell she had once heard during a séance. She said it was her husband's voice, Kettering admitted, eyes lowered. She believed she could reverse something, undo something. That evening, Lady Ethelyn revealed a further truth, that Madame Dervaux's husband had not died by sea, as the public believed, but vanished without explanation during a retreat here, 10 years prior. Poirot walked the chapel grounds with Reverend Blythe, whose hands trembled more with each step. Beneath the sanctuary's warped floorboards, the detective uncovered a bundle of letters, unsent, unsealed, each addressed to Madame Dervaux. In them, Blythe confessed to having known her husband's final moments. He was mad, the Reverend whispered. He believed the bell could erase sin, that if it rang at the hour of confession, God would unmake what had been made. Poirot was silent. Beneath the final letter, a small scrap of sheet music, the same melody that had played faintly from the bell buoy that first night. In the disused cellar of the retreat, behind a false wall that had gone unnoticed for decades, Poirot found what he had dreaded, a room preserved in dust and darkness, a shrine to obsession. The missing husband's journals lined the walls, pages filled with drawings of labyrinthine clockworks and symbols pulled from antique texts. In the center, a table, and on it, the original bell, its mouth sealed with wax. Poirot scraped the wax gently. A gust of cold air spilled out, unnatural and dry. And beneath the bell a locket. Inside, the image of a child. Not Madame Dervaux's child. Not her husband's. A child unknown. Poirot gathered the remaining guests once more in the solarium. The storm outside beat at the windows like desperate hands. He spoke without flourish. "The bell," he said, "was never meant to summon the dead. It was a confession, a memorial not to what was lost, but to what was hidden." He turned to Madame Dervaux, who had emerged from hiding only hours earlier, pale and wordless. "You buried your past beneath this place. But the dead, they do not sleep when lied about." He placed the locket in her hand. Her tears fell silently. "He was my sister's child," she said. "I tried to protect him, but the bell tolls, and so must I." Days later, as the ship departed Calypso Reach, Poirot stood once more on deck, watching the bell buoy vanish into the sea fog. Hastings approached. "Another case closed, Poirot?" Poirot did not smile. "Non, Hastings. Some doors, once opened, do not close. They merely drift." In his pocket, Poirot held the sheet music. Its notes formed no recognizable melody, only sorrow. He looked out to sea, then whispered, "Justice does not always wear robes, mon ami. Sometimes it tolls in silence." A mist hung low over the moors, veiling the carriage path in a gauze of silver as the motor car crept up the incline toward Amaranth Hall. Its spires loomed through the morning fog like watchful sentinels of a past unwilling to be forgotten. Hercule Poirot sat composed within, his silhouette stiff and upright, the mustache impeccable despite the uneven road. As the driver announced their approach, Poirot tilted his head, listening. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, a crow called once and fell silent. "Ah," Poirot whispered, more to the moment than to the driver. "Where the birds do not speak twice, there lies unease." Lord Everard Crowthorne, the current master of Amaranth Hall, greeted Poirot at the carved oak entrance. He was a man of gaunt elegance, his voice like dry parchment, brittle with barely concealed nerves. Behind him stood his niece, Miss Ione Crowthorne, a pale woman with eyes that clutched at each face too long, as though memorizing something destined to vanish. The invitation had been curious, an anonymous letter imploring Poirot to investigate a series of premonitory accidents. Trivial, perhaps, but always narrowly avoiding death. Lord Everard seemed skeptical, embarrassed even, but Miss Ione said nothing. Her silence spoke more than any protest could. The first evening brought a gathering of strained civility. The long dining table was set beneath a canopy of ancestral portraits, whose eyes followed guests like mournful judges. Present were Dr. Basil Larch, a once-renowned surgeon now turned recluse, Lady Sibylla Turn, a medium of some notoriety, Mr. Phineas Hollow, an entomologist obsessed with decay, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Thorne, whose loyalty to the family bordered on fanatical. As dinner was served, Poirot noted the symmetry of the settings, the precision of the courses, and the way each guest flinched, subtly, when the clock struck the hour. Conversation was light, but beneath it pulsed a tension that no wine could smooth. At dawn, a scream cleaved the quiet. Poirot, already awake, found Miss Ione near the marble fountain, breathless and shaking. At her feet lay Mr. Hollow, blood pooling beneath his head. He had fallen, she insisted, from the library balcony above. The cause? Unclear. But Poirot found a footprint, barely visible in the damp soil by the fountain's edge, too large to be Ione's, and pointed oddly inward, as though the walker faced away, but moved forward. In the library, a curtain swayed though no window was open. The smell of old ink and laudanum hung thick in the air. That afternoon, Poirot inspected the house more closely. In the west wing, and used for years, he discovered a sitting room locked from within. Mrs. Thorne claimed it had belonged to Lord Everard's late brother, Osric, whose death decades prior was ruled accidental. But the room was pristine, untouched by dust, with a fireplace recently swept. Poirot found an oddity in the mantel clock. Its mechanism had been altered so it never struck the hour, even as the hands moved faithfully. "A house haunted by what it chooses not to hear," he murmured. And then, in the fireplace ashes, he found the burned edge of parchment, a fragment of Osric's will unfiled. Lady Sibylla insisted upon conducting a séance that evening. Poirot, ever the skeptic, attended nonetheless. They gathered in the music room, lit only by candelabra. Her voice dipped and shivered, claiming to feel a presence. A name buried in ash, a vow unbroken. The child watches still. Poirot saw the way Lord Everard gripped the armrest, his knuckles white. Afterward, Sibylla collapsed, muttering the same 3 words repeatedly. The nursery window. That night, Poirot entered the sealed nursery. The cot had been removed long ago, but a single toy remained, a wooden rattle, carved with the initial O. On the sill, a small handprint, not recent, but preserved in dust as if untouched for decades. With Mrs. Thorne away in town, Poirot seized his chance to explore the servant quarters. In a disused wardrobe, he found a loose board in the wall. Behind it, a stack of letters wrapped in faded ribbon. They were from Osric to a woman named Elira Gray, a governess dismissed in disgrace after a scandal no one would name. The letters told a tale of love, of fear, of a child born in secret. "He will never be safe here," Osric had written. "Everard suspects too much. I hear the clock in my dreams." Dr. Larch was found dead the next morning, at the base of the same balcony. He had been trying to retrieve something from the ivy wall, according to a witness, a small key glinting among the vines. Poirot found it first. It unlocked the West Wing's library cabinet. Within, an oil portrait of a woman with Elira's likeness, and beneath it, a birth certificate. The father's name was left blank, but the child's name was Osric Everard Grey Crowthorne. Poirot gathered the remaining guests. "The accidents," he declared, "were never random. They were acts of erasure. Someone tried to cleanse this house of history." He revealed the child was not only alive, but present, Miss Ione Crowthorne. Not a niece, but the daughter of Osric and Elira, hidden in plain sight. Lord Everard feared scandal, but more, He feared being supplanted. So he buried the truth with Osric, and again with Alira. But secrets buried beneath ancestral stone rarely sleep. Lord Everard made no denial. He merely asked, "And what justice can you offer the dead, monsieur?" Poirot responded, "None, but the living deserve no less than the truth." As Poirot departed Amaranth Hall, the mist parted briefly, revealing the moors in soft dawn light. Hastings, who had arrived late by Telegram's call, walked beside him. "Strange place," he said. "Ghosts and graves and broken clocks." Poirot nodded. "But always, mon ami. The heart of the mystery is human. Pride, guilt, love, they echo longer than footsteps in the hall." He paused, casting a glance back at the house. A bell rang once, far away, though no one had pulled a cord. Poirot smiled faintly. Some echoes, Hastings, refused to fade. And with that, they vanished into the morning. The air above the channel that morning had the texture of crushed linen, cool, gray, and stiff with salt. Hercule Poirot stood at the rail of the steamer Etoile du Nord, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed not upon the sea, but upon the pale silhouette of England emerging from the mist, like a land only half willing to receive him. Hastings had remained in Bruges, with a persistent cough. Thus Poirot traveled alone. Alone, but not without purpose. For clutched in the pocket of his coat was a letter, unsigned, unsealed, and written in an ink so faded it might have been water. The paper had carried no return address, merely a direction. Winterbourne Grange, North Devon. Come swiftly. Something breathes beneath the floorboards. Poirot did not know the sender, nor what lay waiting beneath the ancient timbers of that windswept estate, but something in the cadence of those 12 words disturbed him. Not the threat they implied. He had faced darker things, but the peculiar sadness that haunted their simplicity. The sadness of someone who had already accepted that they might be too late. By dusk, he had arrived at the station at Tavistock, a silent porter guiding him to a waiting carriage. The sky had deepened to cobalt, and the moorland was cloaked in the rising sigh of fog. As the wheels clattered over the last mile toward Winterbourne Grange, Poirot caught sight of the house itself. Not a house, truly, but a shadow of one. Its chimneys clawed at the dying sky. Its leaded windows stared without light. When the carriage stopped, no servant came to greet him. Only a thin woman in mourning stood on the threshold, her black veil motionless in the wind, and her voice little more than a ghost when she whispered, "You came. He said you would, but he is already dead." The dead man, Ambrose Winterbourne, had once been a celebrated cartographer, renowned in academic circles for charting forgotten coastlines and correcting centuries of maritime error. But his fame had faded, and for the last decade he had retreated entirely from public life. His sister, Miss Eugenia Winterbourne, now led Poirot through the corridors of the Grange, her cane tapping rhythmically against the flagstones. "He was not mad, Monsieur Poirot," she said without prompt. "They said he was, after he refused to sell the Grange. But he heard things beneath the floorboards. Whispering. Breathing." Poirot observed her closely. She was precise, deliberate, not fragile, but frayed at the edges, as though she had spent her last decade stitching herself into something tight enough not to unravel. They entered Ambrose's study. The body had not been removed. The fire had long since died to ash, and on the great desk lay an unfurled map of the Devon coastline, annotated with symbols in red wax pencil. Poirot noted 2 details at once: Ambrose's eyes, wide in death but not afraid, and the scent, an almost medicinal aroma, lingering in the air. Not poison. Something older. A cracked teacup lay beside the map. Its contents had not been spilled, but had settled to a silted gray at the bottom. Poirot leaned closer. Not tea at all. A tincture, an infusion. No medical bottles could be seen. No medicine chest. But beneath the desk, tucked into the shallow cavity behind the drawer, he found a single sheet of vellum. Blank. Almost. A faint inscription could be seen only in angled light, where someone had traced words with water or invisible ink. The key is the silence of the well. The next morning, Poirot found himself at breakfast with the remaining occupants of the Grange. Miss Winterbourne presided stiffly at the head of the long oak table, while the housekeeper, Mrs. Locksley, served with hands that trembled despite her firm jaw. Seated to Poirot's right was a young man with the sallow complexion of someone recently ill, Mr. Julian Fry, a distant cousin and the supposed heir to Ambrose's estate. Across from him sat Dr. Isaiah Cardell, a former naval physician and now the village's only doctor. Poirot noted how none wore mourning. Dr. Cardell sipped his black coffee and said, too casually, "Strange thing, a heart giving out like that." But then, Ambrose hadn't left the house in years. That kind of solitude eats at the body. Julian gave a half-hearted nod, though he seemed distracted by the ticking of the grandfather clock at the far end of the hall. He believed he was cursed, he said at last. Ever since his expedition to the tombs of El Wadi, said he brought something back he shouldn't have. Miss Winterbourne's spoon clattered sharply against her saucer. He brought back sand. And madness. No, said Poirot gently. He brought back something he could not leave behind. Poirot asked to see the cellar. Miss Winterbourne seemed reluctant, but relented. Mrs. Locksley led him down stone steps slick with moss. The air grew colder with each descent, until the flame of Poirot's lantern flickered in protest. The cellar was immense, once used for storing wine, now filled with crates of yellowing books and broken furniture. At the far end stood a well. It was not bricked, as one might expect, but carved directly into the granite, irregular and old. Too old. Poirot knelt beside it. The well had been sealed with a heavy iron grate, rusted but locked. On the grate was a symbol, a compass rose, identical to that on Ambrose's maps. Poirot turned. Mrs. Locksley was watching him with an expression both wary and expectant. "You've seen it too, haven't you?" she said quietly. "The way the shadows move when no one is down here." Poirot said nothing, but stared into the darkness below the grate. There was no sound, but there was something. A stillness too heavy to be innocent. The bells of Montreuil-les-Bains tolled 7 as dusk folded itself quietly over the rooftops, turning slate into shadow and cobblestone into ghost. The sea, only a mile away, murmured like a beast just stirred from sleep. Hercule Poirot, wrapped in his overcoat and dignity, stepped off the last train with a valise in hand and a furrow between his brows. He had not come for leisure. Indeed, he had not expected to come at all. Yet the letter, unsigned but unmistakably urgent, had arrived at his hotel in Paris the previous morning. Time is being rewritten. Come to Montreuil-les-Bains before it disappears. Absurd. And yet, deeply unsettling. It was not merely the content, but the postscript in trembling, almost childish script. He built a clock that does not tell time, but erases it. Poirot had not yet deduced whether this was madness or metaphor, but he intended to find out. The inn was run by Madame Fournier, a widow of 30 years, and a woman who spoke with careful restraint, as though her words might betray something if left unguarded. "You have come for Monsieur Caillard, no?" she asked as she poured Poirot a thin cup of chicory. He said you would. That someone would, but he did not say why. Caillard, as Poirot understood, had been a horologist of some repute, an old master in the dying art of clockmaking. He had lived in a house at the top of Rue d'Ambers, a place the townsfolk referred to with some superstition. "The clocks stopped chiming last month," Madame Fournier said, her eyes flicking toward the mantel. "All of them. At once. Midnight on the 3rd of May. Since then, nothing." Caillard's house was tall, narrow, and slightly bowed at the spine, as though burdened by the weight of unseen years. Poirot approached with caution, the cobbled path flanked by hedges overgrown and whispering. Inside, the silence was thick and brittle. Dozens of clocks hung on every wall, grandfather clocks, mantel clocks, cuckoo clocks, some so old they bore no maker's name. And not one ticked. He found Caillard in the drawing-room, seated upright in an armchair, as if waiting for an appointment. He was dead. Poirot saw no sign of violence, no disarray, only the man's eyes, open wide, and staring at a clock on the wall, whose hands moved backward. Inspector Baudin arrived within the hour, his boots heavy and face heavier. "Heart failure, most likely," he muttered. "Old man, no heirs, no enemies. Just a recluse with too many clocks." Poirot disagreed. He examined the backward-ticking clock. It was exquisitely made, but entirely anachronistic. It bore strange markings at each quarter, Symbols, not numbers. And behind the glass, the pendulum was etched with a spiral that drew the eye inward, uncomfortably so. Poirot found himself dizzy after staring for too long. "He built it himself," said a voice. Poirot turned to see a young woman in a green shawl. She introduced herself as Celine Caillard, the old man's estranged niece. He said it would fix the past, that it could erase regret. Celine spoke of her uncle's obsession, not merely with time, but with moments. He believed memory was a mechanism, and that guilt was merely a cog misaligned. If one could turn the gears backward, one might unwind sorrow itself. "He tested it," she said, "once. On himself. After my mother, his sister, died. He blamed himself. Said he'd spoken cruelly to her the night she drowned. He wanted to erase the hour before she died." Poirot listened, the wheels in his own mind turning. At the mayor's office, Poirot requested death records for the 3rd of May. There were none. Not just for Caillard, but for the entire town. No births, no deaths, no events logged. A blank page. He returned to the house and wound the backward clock. The spiral pendulum began to move again. And for a moment, just a moment, Poirot heard something not mechanical, but human, a sob. Distant. Trapped. As though someone had been caught inside the mechanism of time itself. In the study, Poirot found Caillard's journal hidden behind a false panel. Its pages chronicled a descent not into madness, but into terrifying clarity. To erase 1 hour is to break the sequence. Time does not heal, it punishes. It folds back. I have seen my sister again, but not as she was. She knows I have tampered. Her eyes, God forgive me, they are empty. Poirot closed the book with reverence and sorrow. He now understood. Caillard had not merely rewound a memory. He had created a paradox, a loop in time that unstitched one life to repair another, and in so doing, had lost both. Poirot summoned Celine to the house one last time. He showed her the journal, the clock, the backward hour. "You must decide," he said. "Destroy it, or become its keeper." She wept. He only wanted to say sorry. "Then say it," Poirot said gently, "but do not undo it." She struck the clock with a fire iron, and it shattered like bone. The clocks began ticking again that night. All of them. And when they struck midnight, a soft breeze stirred through the house, carrying with it the faintest sound of laughter. Not cruel, but released. As though the dead had finally exhaled. Poirot stood beneath the moon, watching its reflection in a fountain long gone dry. "To forget is not healing," he murmured. "To forgive, that is the greater art." As he boarded the morning train, Poirot felt the weight of time return to its rightful place, on the wrist, not the soul. Montreux-les-Bains disappeared behind him, a town no longer paused. And in his pocket, he carried a single gear from the broken clock, not as evidence, but as a reminder. That time, once broken, should never be tempted twice. Thank you for joining me, dear listeners, in Montreux-les-Bains, a place where time faltered and the past whispered too loud to be ignored. In the quiet ticking of clocks, we often forget. The moments we long to change are the very ones that shape us. Until our next mystery unwinds.